Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the biting winds and deep snows of Siberia, long before the whispers of revolution turned into shouts, to explore the early life of a man who would become one of history's most enigmatic and controversial figures, Grigori Rasputin. Imagine, if you will, the vast, unending expanse of the Russian wilderness, the kind of place where the silence is so profound it almost hums, and the darkness of a winter night feels absolute. We're going to trace his path from a remote village to the gilded heart of an empire on the brink. You're about to walk into a world of superstition, fervent faith, and simmering discontent. And honestly, given the eventual chaos surrounding this fellow, you probably won't survive this, in the sense that the old world order he became entangled with certainly didn't. It's a journey into a character who some called a saint and others a demon, a man whose influence would be accused of poisoning an entire dynasty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, it's always fascinating to see where you all are tuning in from. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. It makes this vast digital world feel a little cozier, doesn't it? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wind howls outside your small, sturdy wooden izba, a relentless, mournful sound that seems to carry the very essence of the Siberian taiga. It's a sound that's been the soundtrack to countless nights in the village of Pokrovskoye, nestled on the banks of the Tura River. You feel the chill seeping through the log walls, despite the banked fire in the great earthen stove that dominates one corner of the room. It's a cold that settles deep in your bones, the kind of cold that makes even the briefest journey outside a monumental effort, enough to make a polar bear look for a thermal vest. Lamplight flickers, casting dancing shadows that make the familiar shapes of bundled furs and simple tools seem strange and alive. This is the world into which Grigori Yefimovich Novik, later known as Rasputin, was born, sometime around 1869. The exact date, like so much about him, remains shrouded in a bit of Siberian mist. You imagine him as a child in this very village, one of many peasant children in a land where life is a constant struggle against the elements, against poverty, against the vast distances that separate you from, well, from almost anywhere else of consequence. The air here is thick with the scent of pine smoke, damp wool, and the faint, earthy smell of livestock huddled nearby for warmth. The rhythms of life are dictated by the seasons, the frantic, short summer of planting and harvesting, and the long, seemingly endless winter of waiting, mending, and storytelling. Stories are important here. They're the threads that bind the community together. Tales of saints and sinners, of forest spirits, and the power of faith. And it's a fervent, often mystical faith that burns brightly in these isolated communities. A deep Russian orthodoxy blended with older, perhaps even pagan, undercurrents. Young Grigori, you hear, wasn't like the other children. While they played their rough and tumble games, he was often different. Some villagers would later recall him as a quiet, observant boy, perhaps a little too observant, with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Others painted a picture of a boisterous, unruly youth, quick to anger and quicker to find trouble. The truth, as it often is, likely lies somewhere in between, or perhaps both are true, different facets of a complex, burgeoning personality. Historians continue to debate the exact nature and extent of Rasputin's early religious experiences, and whether they were genuine or a precursor to later manipulations. Was he truly touched by something divine? Or was he an astute learner of human nature, even from a young age, figuring out how belief could be a powerful tool? One of the few concrete pieces of information from this period is that Grigori Yefimovich Novik was indeed born in Pokrovskoye, Tobolsk Governorate, Siberia. This isn't St. Petersburg with its grand architecture and Western aspirations. This is the Russian frontier, a place of raw, untamed beauty and equally raw, untamed human experience. Education, in the formal sense, was a luxury few could afford or even see the need for. Grigori, it said, remained functionally illiterate for much, if not all, of his life. His wisdom, or cunning, drawn from observation, experience, and an innate understanding of the human psyche, particularly the rural peasant psyche. Imagine him, then, not yet the mad monk of lurid legend, but a lanky village lad, perhaps with those soon-to-be famous piercing eyes already unsettling his peers. He'd have done his share of farm work, the back-breaking labor that defined peasant existence. He'd have known the bite of hunger, the sting of the cold, the simple joys of a summer festival, and the deep, pervasive religiosity that was the bedrock of his community. There were stories, even then, tales of him knowing things he shouldn't, perhaps identifying a horse thief by some uncanny insight, or calming a spooked animal with a touch. Were these embroidered later, in light of his fame? Almost certainly. Yet, something about him must have stood out, something that laid the groundwork for the path he would eventually take. His family name, Novik, means new or newcomer, though they were established in the village. Perhaps there was always a sense of being slightly apart, slightly different. He had siblings, some of whom died in infancy, a common tragedy in those times, and one that would deeply affect his own later role as a father, and perhaps his famous intervention with the Tsar's son. The darkness of those long Siberian nights, lit only by stars of incredible brilliance or the eerie glow of the aurora borealis, would have given ample time for introspection, for the development of an inner world. Entertainment options, after all, were somewhat limited, mostly involving staring at a potato or, for a wild night, 2 potatoes. So, the mind would wander, would it not, into dreams, into prayers, into the vast unknown that the church spoke of. There were also, it must be said, less saintly stories, tales of petty theft, of rowdiness, of a certain wildness. Grigori was no plaster saint in his youth. Let's just say he wasn't exactly president of the local youth club. This duality, this ability to encompass both the spiritual and the carnal, the devout and the roguish, would be a hallmark of his entire life. It's what made him so fascinating to some and so repellent to others. He wasn't easily categorized, then or now. He married a local girl, Praskovia Dubrovina, and they had children. For a time, it might have seemed he was destined for a typical peasant life work, family, faith, and the slow turning of the Siberian seasons. But something was stirring within him, a restlessness, a calling, or perhaps an ambition that the confines of Pokrovskoye could not contain. He began to wander, undertaking pilgrimages to various holy sites. This wasn't uncommon. pilgrimage was a significant part of Russian spiritual life. But for Grigori, it seems to have been transformative. He would be gone for months, sometimes years, journeying to monasteries, seeking out holy men, absorbing their teachings, and crucially, developing his own unique spiritual persona. He became a strannik, a holy wanderer, a figure respected and sometimes revered in rural Russia. These wanderers were seen as men of God, unburdened by worldly possessions, offering prayers and spiritual guidance. You can picture him on these journeys, a rough-hewn figure striding along dusty or muddy tracks, his gaze fixed on some distant inner horizon. He would have learned how to survive, how to command attention, how to speak with authority about matters of the soul. He encountered a wide cross-section of Russian society, from fellow peasants to minor clergy, honing his ability to connect with people, to read their needs and their vulnerabilities. This was his university, the vast, complex, and deeply spiritual landscape of provincial Russia. The air in your imagined Siberian dwelling grows colder as the night deepens. The fire in the stove is now just glowing embers. Outside, the only sounds are the sigh of the wind and perhaps the distant howl of a wolf, a reminder of the wildness that is never far away. It's in this environment, so far removed from the glittering salons of power, that the man who would one day hold the fate of an empire in his hands was forged. The deep, unshakable faith of the peasantry, their belief in signs and wonders, their respect for those who seem to possess a direct line to the divine. These were the currents that shaped Grigori Novik, and that he would later navigate with such astonishing and ultimately devastating skill. The trust here, in these small villages, is primal. Trust in God, trust in the land, trust in the Tsar, a distant, almost mythical father figure. It's a foundation of belief that seems, in this moment, as solid and enduring as the Siberian winter. But even the deepest freeze eventually thaws, and sometimes, what's revealed underneath is not what anyone expected. The stirrings of the mystic were beginning, and with them, the first, almost imperceptible tremors that would one day shake an empire to its core, murdering its most sacred bonds of trust. The embers in that Siberian stove have long since turned to cold ash, and the wind, your constant companion, seems to push you, along with Grigori, out from the familiar confines of Pokrovskoye. You leave behind the scent of pine smoke and the close-knit, if sometimes stifling, embrace of village life. Now, the road is your home, a seemingly endless ribbon uspeka, success. Or in this context, simple forward movement unwinding across the vastness of Russia. You feel the rough weave of his simple pilgrim's garb against your skin, the chill of the morning mist that clings to the low-lying fields, and the gnawing ache of an often empty stomach. This is the life of the strannik, the holy wanderer, a path Grigori has chosen, or perhaps a path that has chosen him. His TripAdvisor reviews for abandoned hermit cave. No Wi-Fi would have been mixed at best. The nights are spent wherever shelter can be found, a welcoming peasant's hut, the quiet corner of a remote monastery, or sometimes simply under the star-strewn canopy of the heavens, with only the rustling leaves or the distant cry of a nightbird for company. You watch him, this man from the backwoods, transforming. The awkward village lad is slowly being replaced by a figure of increasing intensity. His eyes, always remarkable, now seem to burn with a fervent light, whether from divine inspiration, hunger, or an uncanny understanding of the human soul? It's hard for you to tell. He prays for hours, sometimes prostrating himself on the cold earth, his voice a low murmur that blends with the sounds of the wilderness. He speaks to those he meets with a simple, direct piety, offering blessings, sometimes a healing touch for minor ailments, or just a listening ear to tales of woe and hardship. His reputation, like a seed carried on the wind, begins to take root in scattered places. Whispers follow him, precede him. Have you heard of the man from Siberia? They might say in the lamplit quiet of a village inn. They say he has the gift of sight, or he healed my cousin's lame goat with a prayer. You know how stories grow with each telling, especially when there's a goat involved. During his wanderings, Rasputin developed a reputation as a Starets' spiritual elder, teacher, though he never held any formal church position. This is crucial. He wasn't ordained, had no official standing within the Orthodox Church hierarchy. His authority was purely personal, derived from his perceived holiness, his ascetic lifestyle at least in these early wandering days, and the power of his personality. He was, in a sense, a spiritual freelancer. Outside the established structures, you trudge alongside him through forests that seem to stretch on forever, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. You cross wide, slow-moving rivers on rickety ferries, the water the color of lead under an overcast sky. He's learning, always learning. He learns how to read people, their hopes, their fears, their deep-seated need for meaning and comfort in a harsh world. He learns what to say, how to say it, how to hold his gaze just so, creating an impression of profound spiritual depth. Is it a calculated act, a performance honed through countless interactions? Or is he genuinely channeling something beyond himself? Even now, as you walk in his shadow, the line feels blurry, indistinct. Sometimes, he encounters skepticism, even hostility. Not everyone is charmed by a wandering holy man. Local priests, perhaps jealous of their own authority or suspicious of his unorthodox ways, might eye him with distrust. You see him face them down, not with aggression, but with an unshakable self-assurance, perhaps a disarmingly simple theological argument, or by simply outpraying them. He was collecting contacts like they were rare Pokemon, except his were mostly bearded men in robes, each one a potential stepping stone, a name to be mentioned in the right ear. The vastness of Russia unfolds before you. One region gives way to another, each with its own subtle variations in dialect, custom, and landscape. He travels for months, even years, on these pilgrimages. Some say he reached Mount Athos in Greece, that bastion of Orthodox monasticism, a place of legendary spiritual rigor. Others claim he journeyed as far as Jerusalem, walking in the very footsteps of Christ. The precise routes and specific individuals who funded or facilitated Rasputin's extensive travels remain a subject of considerable scholarly inquiry. Did devout patrons, impressed by his piety, provide him with the means, or did he simply live off the charity of those he met along the way? As many Straniki did. The details are lost to the mists of time and the embellishments of legend. What is certain is that these journeys changed him, and changed how others perceived him. He was no longer just Grigori from Pokrovskoye. He was becoming Father Grigori, the man of God, the healer, the seer. The whispers are growing louder now, carried along the networks of pilgrims, merchants, and wandering folk. They speak of his intense eyes, his ability to soothe troubled souls, his strange, sometimes unsettling pronouncements. He's building a mystique, layer by layer, story by story. And as he travels, you sense a subtle shift in his trajectory. Initially, the wanderings might have been a genuine spiritual quest, a search for answers, for God. But gradually, perhaps, a new destination begins to form in his mind, a glow on the distant horizon, St. Petersburg, the capital, the heart of the empire, where the Tsar, God's anointed, resided. It was the ultimate stage, the place where a man of his talents could truly make his mark. He wouldn't have been the first holy man, or purported holy man, to be drawn to the allure of the court, seeking to influence the powerful, to whisper guidance into the ears of those who shaped the destiny of Russia. Imagine the contrast, the quiet, earthy spirituality of the countryside, the rough-hewn faith of the peasantry, versus the sophisticated, often decadent, world of the St. Petersburg aristocracy, a world where traditional beliefs were often intertwined with fashionable mysticism, spiritualism, and a desperate search for meaning or novelty. It was a world ripe for someone like Rasputin, someone who seemed to offer a more authentic, more potent connection to the divine than the formal, ritualized religion of the state church. As he gets closer to the more populated Western regions, the nature of his reception changes. He's no longer just a curiosity. People seek him out. Minor nobles, disillusioned with the emptiness of their lives, or desperate for solutions to personal problems, hear tales of the Siberian mystic and invite him to their estates. He stays for a while, offering prayers, spiritual counsel, perhaps a bit of folk healing. He learns their ways, their language, their vulnerabilities. He's like a chameleon, adapting to his surroundings while retaining his core enigmatic persona. When he arrived in new towns, they were not exactly rolling out the red carpet for a dusty, unkempt wanderer, unless it was to tell him to keep moving, at least in the very beginning. But his growing reputation began to smooth these entries. The glow of St. Petersburg, once a distant rumor, becomes a tangible goal. You can almost feel the pull it exerts on him, a magnetic force drawing him towards the center of power. The air itself seems different as you travel west. The forests are still vast, the winters still brutal, but there's a sense of proximity to something grand, something momentous. The whispers are consolidating, forming a narrative. This isn't just some random peasant with wild ideas. This is a man touched by God, a man with a special destiny. Or so the stories go. And Grigori, you sense, is beginning to believe them himself, or at least to understand their power. The trust he is cultivating now is on a more intimate, personal scale. He gains the confidence of individuals, one by one, offering them solace, a sense of spiritual connection, perhaps even a frisson of the forbidden or the miraculous. He's tapping into a deep well of spiritual hunger and, in some cases, desperation. These early patrons, these first believers among the gentry, will become the conduits, the ones who will carry the whispers of his name into the very antechambers of power. The journey from the silent, snow-bound nights of Siberia to the lamplit, rumor-filled salons of the capital is almost complete. The unlettered peasant is on the verge of stepping onto a stage far grander and far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined in his wooden izba by the Tura River. The empire's trust, still seemingly robust, is unknowingly awaiting its most peculiar and insidious challenge. The biting winds of the open road and the scent of damp earth slowly fade from your senses, replaced by a symphony of new sensations as you and Grigori finally approach the grand, sprawling city of St. Petersburg. It's a world away from Pokrovskoye, a world away from the quiet monasteries and dusty pilgrim tracks. The air here thrums with a different kind of energy, the clatter of iron-shod carriage wheels on cobblestones, the distant strains of military bands, the murmur of countless conversations in a language that suddenly sounds crisper, more formal. Even the lamplight seems different, no longer the solitary flicker in a peasant's izba, but a multitude of glowing gas lamps lining wide, imposing boulevards, casting an almost theatrical glow on the ornate facades of stone palaces. This is the Venice of the North, a city built on ambition and imperial decree, and it feels both magnificent and slightly unreal to you. After so long in the vast, untamed wilderness, Grigori, you observe, takes it all in, his peasant shrewdness adapting, his piercing eyes missing nothing. He might be dressed in simple, even coarse, attire, smelling faintly of the road, and perhaps a touch of something uniquely Grigori. But there's a confidence about him now, an assurance that wasn't there in the uncertain youth from Siberia. He carries the accumulated weight of his wanderings, the whispers of his growing fame, like an invisible mantle. He's not here as a tourist. He's here with a sense of purpose, drawn by those earlier connections, those names passed along, those ladies of minor nobility who saw in him a spiritual conduit. He was networking his way up the spiritual ladder, which, surprisingly, had actual rungs made of countesses and grand dukes. You follow him into the rarefied atmosphere of the St. Petersburg salons. These are not the humble peasant gatherings around a crackling fire. Here, in rooms adorned with gilded mirrors, heavy velvet curtains, and the soft gleam of polished mahogany, society's elite gather. The air is thick with the scent of French perfume, expensive cigars, and delicate pastries. Conversations are a complex dance of wit, insinuation, and carefully guarded secrets. It's a world of intense social maneuvering, where the gossip was more valuable than gold, and a new mystic was the equivalent of a surprise celebrity guest star. And Grigori, the rough-hewn mujik from Siberia, is the latest, most intriguing sensation. He's introduced by figures like the Montenegrin princesses, Milica and Anastasia, sometimes known as the Black Princesses, due to their fascination with the occult and mysticism. They, along with other spiritually adventurous society ladies, see in Rasputin something raw, authentic, a direct line to the god they feel is missing in the overly formal rituals of the established church. You watch as these finely dressed women, adorned with jewels that could feed his entire village for a year, hang on his every word. He speaks to them, not in the polished phrases of the court, but with the simple, sometimes crude, yet forceful language of the peasantry, often quoting scripture, telling parables, and offering pronouncements with an air of absolute conviction. He doesn't entirely fit, of course. His manners can be uncouth, his eating habits perhaps a little too enthusiastic for polite company, yet this very incongruity, this otherness, becomes part of his allure. He's not one of them. He's a holy fool, a man of God, uncorrupted by their sophisticated cynicism. Or so they believe. The extent to which influential church figures initially promoted or merely tolerated Rasputin's entry into court circles is a matter on which contemporary accounts and later historical analyses offer differing perspectives. Some clergymen, like the archimandrite Theophan, initially saw genuine piety in him and helped open doors. Others were deeply suspicious from the start, viewing him as a charlatan or, worse, something more sinister. The nights in St. Petersburg are a whirl of these salon gatherings. Lamplight spills from the tall windows of aristocratic mansions, painting golden rectangles on the snow-covered streets below. Inside, Rasputin holds court, his voice a low rumble, his eyes mesmerizing. He speaks of sin and redemption, of the simple faith of the Russian people, of the need for repentance. He might offer a blessing, lay his hands on a troubled soul, or even break into a rustic peasant dance if the mood takes him, shocking and delighting his audience in equal measure. It's a performance, in part, but there's also a core of something else, a deep, intuitive understanding of human psychology, of their spiritual yearnings, their hidden anxieties, their desperate need for certainty in an uncertain world. And at the very heart of this glittering, anxious city lies the imperial family, Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna. You feel the weight of their presence even before you glimpse the heavily guarded walls of the Alexander Palace. They live in a gilded cage, increasingly isolated from their people, surrounded by a rigid court etiquette that stifles genuine connection. The Tsarina, in particular, is a figure of intense, almost desperate, piety, a German princess by birth, a convert to Russian Orthodoxy. She embraced her adopted faith with a fervent zeal that sometimes unsettled even those around her. But her greatest sorrow, the shadow that hangs over her life and the life of the Tsar, is the health of their only son, the Tsarevich Alexei. Alexei, the heir to the vast Romanov Empire, suffers from hemophilia, the royal disease. A minor bump, a small cut, can lead to agonizing, life-threatening bleeding. The best doctors in Europe are powerless, their remedies ineffective. Imagine the constant terror, the crushing anxiety of living with this knowledge. Every moment is fraught with potential disaster. It is this desperation, this profound maternal anguish, that creates the opening, the vulnerability, for someone like Rasputin. The whispers about the Siberian holy man, the healer, inevitably reach the ears of the Tsarina's closest confidant, Anna Vyrubova. Anna, deeply devoted to Alexandra, becomes convinced that Rasputin is their last, best hope. The moment of introduction, when it finally comes, is shrouded in the soft glow of palace lamplight. You can picture the scene, the opulent, yet somehow sterile, grandeur of the imperial residence. The air is hushed, formal, and into this setting steps Grigori Rasputin, the peasant from Pokrovskoye. He's probably not what they were expecting when they ordered one rustic holy man delivery to the palace gates. Rasputin was first introduced to Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra on November 1st, 1905. Old style. The Tsar notes it in his diary. A brief, almost perfunctory entry. Made the acquaintance of a man of God, Grigori, from Tobolsk province. He could not have known, no one could have known, the profound and devastating consequences that would flow from that seemingly innocuous meeting. For Alexandra, however, it is more than just an acquaintance. She sees in Rasputin's intense gaze, in his simple words of faith, a beacon of hope. He speaks to her not as an empress, but as a suffering mother. He assures her of God's mercy, of the power of prayer. He doesn't offer sophisticated medical theories. He offers spiritual comfort, a sense of divine intervention. And crucially, in the coming months and years, during Alexei's terrifying bleeding episodes, Rasputin's presence, his prayers, will appear to coincide with the boy's recovery, whether through hypnotic suggestion, the calming of the distraught mother, which in turn calmed the child, reducing blood pressure, or sheer coincidence. The effect is undeniable. Alexandra becomes utterly convinced that Rasputin is a holy man sent by God to save her son, and by extension, the dynasty, the trust, that most precious and fragile of commodities, begins to shift. The Tsarina, and gradually the Tsar, begin to place an extraordinary degree of trust in this unkempt mystic from Siberia. It's a trust born of desperation, nurtured by perceived miracles, and shielded from the growing chorus of criticism and outrage from outside the palace walls. The lamplight within those imperial rooms illuminates the beginning of a bond that will isolate the Romanovs further. A bond that will be seen by many as a betrayal of their sacred duty to Russia. A bond that will contribute directly to the erosion and eventual murder of an empire's faith in its rulers. The peasant has reached the palace, and the gilded cage has a new and highly unorthodox occupant influencing its very heart. The glittering chandeliers of the St. Petersburg salons, with their scented air and whispered intrigues, fade into a more somber, pervasive glow as you draw closer to the heart of the imperial family's private suffering. You find yourself within the hallowed, yet anxious, halls of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar and Tsarina's preferred residence. Here, the lamplight is often softer, more subdued, filtering through heavy curtains or emanating from shaded lamps that cast long, melancholic shadows down the endless corridors. There's a constant, underlying tension, a fragility that belies the immense power this family theoretically wields. This tension crystallizes around one small, frail body, Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, the sole male heir to the Romanov throne. You feel the oppressive weight of the heir's shadow, the ever-present threat of his illness. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich suffered from hemophilia B, a deficiency in clotting factor 9, inherited from his mother. Tsarina Alexandra, a carrier of the gene descended from Queen Victoria. This grim biological lottery means that for Alexei, the most ordinary childhood mishap, a bump, a fall, even a spontaneous bleed into a joint, can become a life-threatening crisis. The palace, meant to be a sanctuary, often transforms into a hushed sick room, a battleground where hope and despair wage a relentless war. The scent of carbolic acid and ether sometimes hangs faintly in the air, a testament to the constant, often futile, ministrations of the court physicians. These learned men, with all their fancy degrees and impressive beards, were about as useful as a chocolate teapot in a blizzard when it came to Alexei's underlying condition. They could offer little more than palliatives, their grave expressions mirroring the parents' fear. Imagine one such night. A cry from Alexei's rooms, a sudden, inexplicable pain in his leg or abdomen. The telltale swelling begins, the dark bruising beneath the skin. You see the frantic activity servants rushing, doctors summoned, their voices low and concerned. Tsarina Alexandra is a pillar of terrified strength, her face pale, her eyes wide with that familiar maternal anguish. Tsar Nicholas, a man who commands armies and rules over a sixth of the world's landmass, stands by helplessly, his gentle face etched with sorrow and impotence. The lamplight in the sick room casts a dim, flickering glow on the scene. The small boy, whimpering in pain, his limbs perhaps already contorted by internal bleeding, the anxious faces of his attendants, the array of medical paraphernalia that offers so little real comfort. Hours pass. The child's condition worsens. The doctors confer in hushed tones, their options exhausted. Despair begins to creep into the room, cold and insidious. And then, a message is sent, a desperate plea. Send for Father Grigori. When Rasputin arrives, his presence changes the atmosphere in the room almost palpably. He is a stark contrast to the polished, uniformed doctors and courtiers. He might be unwashed, his peasant clothes smelling of the stables or some indefinable earthy aroma. He doesn't bring medical instruments or complicated theories. He brings himself, his unwavering confidence, and his prayers. You watch as he approaches the child's bedside. He might make the sign of the cross, murmur prayers in his deep, sonorous voice, or simply sit quietly, his intense gaze fixed on Alexei. He speaks to the boy gently, reassuringly, his tone calm and soothing. He didn't bother with complex medical jargon, probably because he didn't know any, but his there, it'll be all right, little father approach seemed to work wonders, or at least wonders on the boy's mother. And then, the seeming miracle occurs, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The bleeding begins to subside. The child's pain lessens. He falls into a restful sleep. The crisis passes. The doctors are baffled, perhaps a little resentful. Alexandra, however, is overwhelmed with gratitude, her eyes shining with tears of relief and unwavering faith. To her, it is proof positive Rasputin is a man of God, a holy intercessor, sent to save her beloved son. Whether Rasputin's apparent ability to alleviate Tsarevich Alexei's suffering was due to hypnotic suggestion, a placebo effect amplified by the Tsarina's faith, his purported ability to calm the child and thereby the mother, leading to a less stressful environment which could physically help the child, or simply fortunate timing coinciding with natural remissions, is still a topic of considerable conjecture among biographers and medical historians. Some theories suggest he might have advised against the use of certain contemporary medications like aspirin, which, unknown at the time, is an anticoagulant and would have worsened the bleeding. By simply stopping harmful treatments, improvement could have occurred. Others point to the power of his hypnotic gaze and soothing voice, which could have calmed Alexei, reducing his heart rate and blood pressure, thereby aiding the natural clotting process. However inefficient it was, whatever the mechanism, the effect on Alexandra is profound and absolute. Each episode like this, and there are several critical ones recorded, binds her ever more tightly to Rasputin. He becomes our friend, an indispensable figure in their private lives. Her devotion is understandable. If you place yourself in her shoes, a desperate mother watching her child suffer, offered a lifeline by a man who, in her eyes, repeatedly demonstrates a unique power to heal or alleviate that suffering. If Rasputin had suggested the boy wear a garlic necklace and dance the Macarena, she'd have probably ordered the court composer to write the music and sewn the garlic onto Alexei's pajamas herself. Her letters to Nicholas are filled with references to Rasputin's wisdom, his holiness, his divine guidance. This deep, personal trust, forged in the crucible of Alexei's illness, begins to have ramifications far beyond the sick room. Because Alexandra trusts Rasputin implicitly with the life of her son, she starts to trust his judgment on other matters as well. If he is divinely inspired enough to save Alexei, surely his insights into people, into matters of state, must also be valuable. This is the subtle, insidious creep. The trust given to the healer starts to morph into deference to the advisor. You see the Tsar, a devoted husband and father, increasingly influenced by his wife's unwavering faith in Rasputin. Nicholas himself is a deeply religious man, prone to a certain fatalism and a belief in the wisdom of simple, God-fearing Russian peasants. Rasputin fits this image, at least on the surface. While Nicholas may not have shared the full intensity of Alexandra's adoration, he respected her feelings and acknowledged Rasputin's apparent ability to help Alexei. He allows our friend continued access, listens to his opinions, even if he doesn't always act on them directly. The shadow of the heir's illness thus casts a much longer shadow over Russia itself. The private anxieties of the imperial family and their reliance on this controversial peasant mystic become inextricably linked with the governance of the empire. Decisions that should be based on policy, on expertise, on the well-being of the nation, start to be influenced, or are perceived to be influenced, by the man who can seemingly stop the Tsarevich's bleeding. The trust that the nation, particularly the educated classes and the aristocracy, has in the Tsar's judgment begins to erode. How can they trust a Tsar who himself trusts such a disreputable and unqualified figure? The seeming miracle in the lamplit sick room becomes a cornerstone for the murderer of an empire's trust, providing Rasputin with an unassailable emotional leverage over the very people who symbolize the empire's continuity and stability. The boy's fragile life and the mystic's mysterious influence are now dangerously intertwined, pulling the dynasty further into a private world that the public can only view with suspicion and growing alarm. The immediate terror of Alexei's crises may have subsided for now, but the imprint they've left on the Tsarina's soul, and by extension, on the very fabric of the imperial household, is indelible. You find yourself now less in the starkly lit sick room and more in the plush, heavily curtained private apartments of Tsarina Alexandra. It's a world of quiet devotion, whispered confidences, and an almost suffocating intimacy. This is the golden cage, a term that aptly describes not only the opulent surroundings, but also the increasing isolation of the imperial family. An isolation in which Grigori Rasputin thrives and his influence blossoms like a strange, hardy flower in a meticulously tended, yet ultimately artificial, garden. The lamplight here is soft, often emanating from the flickering flames before numerous icons, casting a gentle, holy glow that seems to sanctify the conversations held within these sacred, private spaces. You observe Rasputin moving through these rooms with an air of complete familiarity. He's no longer the hesitant newcomer, awed by palace grandeur. He's our friend, a spiritual guide, a confidant, a comforter. His rough peasant boots tread upon exquisite Sivanery carpets. His simple tunic, a stark contrast to the silks and laces of the ladies who flock around him. Getting into Alexandra's inner sanctum was harder than getting a front-row ticket to the Imperial Ballet, and Rasputin had an all-access lifetime pass, one he used frequently. Central to this inner circle is Anna Vyrubova. Anna Vyrubova, the Tsarina's closest friend and lady-in-waiting, was a fervent believer in Rasputin and played a crucial role in facilitating his access and influence over Alexandra. Anna is a woman of simple, unwavering devotion, both to her empress and to the holy man she believes God has sent them. Her apartment becomes a frequent meeting place, a kind of antechamber to Alexandra's own private world. You see her there, her eyes often red-rimmed from weeping, whether from religious ecstasy, sympathy for the Tsarina's sorrows, or the sheer emotional intensity of being around Rasputin. It's hard to tell. Anna was so devoted to our friend that if Rasputin had declared Tuesdays were now officially Potato Day, she'd have had the palace chefs whipping up spud-based banquets and probably written a pamphlet on the spiritual significance of the noble tuber. It's through Anna and a few other like-minded ladies, the big candles and little candles as they were sometimes known, women like Princess Olga Orlova or Countess Anastasia Hendrikova, that Rasputin's influence is amplified and reinforced. They form an echo chamber around Alexandra. Any doubts the Tsarina might fleetingly entertain are quickly soothed by their shared adoration of Grigori. Any criticism from the outside world is dismissed as slander, the work of enemies who do not understand, who lack true faith. You can almost feel the walls of the golden cage solidifying, the bars growing thicker, gilded with piety and unwavering conviction. The conversations you overhear are a curious blend of the sacred and the mundane. Rasputin will speak of God, of the need for humility and repentance, his voice deep and mesmerizing. He'll offer prayers for Alexei's health, for the Tsar's well-being, for Russia. But then, the talk might shift. Alexandra, anxious about her husband's burdens, worried about the loyalty of certain ministers or generals, will seek Rasputin's insight. "Father Grigori," she might ask, her voice hushed, "what do you feel about Minister X? Is he a good man? Is he true to us?" And Rasputin, perhaps after a moment of feigned or genuine spiritual contemplation, his eyes half closed, will offer an opinion. It might be based on some peasant intuition, a snippet of gossip he's picked up, or simply a desire to please his benefactress or settle a score with someone who slighted him. Some of his political insights probably came from the same place as his fashion sense, somewhere unique and deeply personal, but not necessarily fit for public consumption. Yet, to Alexandra, these pronouncements carry the weight of divine wisdom. If God speaks through him to save her son, surely God also speaks through him on matters of state, on who can be trusted and who cannot. Historians offer varying interpretations regarding the degree to which Tsarina Alexandra's reliance on Rasputin was a product of her own deeply mystical nature versus a rational, in her view, response to her son's medical condition and the perceived failures of conventional medicine and political advice. Was she a naive, hysterical woman completely manipulated by a cunning peasant, or was she a desperate mother and a devout believer who, finding something that demonstrably seemed to work where all else failed Alexei's health, logically extended that trust into other areas, especially when surrounded by what she perceived as incompetence or disloyalty among the established elite? The truth is likely a complex tapestry woven from all these threads. You see letters being written, intimate notes from Alexandra to Nicholas, who is often away at military headquarters, especially as the clouds of war gather. These letters are filled with endearments for her husband, anxieties for her children, and frequent, glowing references to our friend's advice. Listen to our friend, she'll urge. He sees so clearly. Our friend says we must be firm. This stream of advice, filtered through Alexandra's intense conviction and Rasputin's often simplistic or self-serving views, begins to have a real impact on the Tsar's decisions, or at least on his state of mind. The atmosphere within this inner circle is thick with emotion, with a sense of spiritual exaltation. They see themselves as a small band of true believers, protecting the divinely appointed Tsar and Tsarevich from a corrupt and uncomprehending world. Rasputin provides them with a sense of certainty, a direct line to God's will, in a time of increasing uncertainty and social upheaval. He tells them what they want to hear, that they are chosen, that they are right, that God is on their side. But outside the palace walls, the whispers are no longer just about a curious holy man. They are turning into angry murmurs, into scandalous rumors, tales of Rasputin's behavior outside the palace, his drinking, his womanizing, his crude boasting, begin to circulate, amplified by those who resent his influence. These stories, whether entirely true, exaggerated, or fabricated, paint a picture utterly at odds with the saintly image cultivated within Alexandra's circle. The disconnect is staggering. Inside the golden cage, however, such stories are dismissed as malicious lies. Rasputin himself, when confronted, might offer a typically disarming or enigmatic explanation. Perhaps he takes on the sins of others to purify them, or maybe his accusers are simply jealous or wicked. His protectors, led by the Tsarina, choose to believe him, their faith unshakable, their loyalty absolute. This fierce protectiveness further isolates them, making them appear deaf to legitimate concerns and blind to the damage being done to the monarchy's reputation. The trust that is being murdered here is not just the Tsar's trust in conventional advisors, but the trust of the wider political and social establishment in the Tsarina herself, and through her, in the Tsar. She is increasingly seen as the primary conduit for Rasputin's dangerous influence, a woman so enthralled by a peasant mystic that she is leading her husband and the country astray. The German woman, already viewed with suspicion by some, becomes even more of a target. Her reliance on Rasputin seen as proof of her unfitness, her foreignness, her dangerous religiosity. The golden cage, intended to be a sanctuary of faith and family, becomes a symbol of the monarchy's detachment from reality, a breeding ground for the very forces that will ultimately lead to its destruction. And at its center, seemingly oblivious to the storm gathering outside, sits Grigori Rasputin, no longer just a healer, but a power broker, his influence growing with every prayer whispered in the lamplit intimacy of the Tsarina's private world. The soft, almost hallowed lamplight of the Tsarina's private apartments, with its atmosphere of fervent belief and whispered confidences, begins to feel increasingly like a brightly lit stage viewed from a darkening auditorium. As you step, in your mind's eye, beyond the gilded gates of Tsarskoye Selo and back into the broader avenues and bustling salons of St. Petersburg, you notice a distinct change in the air. The dusk isn't just the fading light of another St. Petersburg evening. It's a palpable mood settling over Russia, a dimming of optimism, a creeping chill of unease. The seeds of doubt, once tiny, almost invisible, are beginning to sprout with alarming speed, their tendrils reaching into every corner of society, fueled by the ever-expanding legend of Grigori Rasputin. You hear his name everywhere now, not just in the adoring whispers of the imperial inner circle, but in the shocked murmurs of aristocratic drawing rooms, the angry denunciations in smoky political clubs, and even in the coarse jokes and bewildered questions of ordinary folk in the marketplaces and taverns. The stories about Rasputin were getting wilder than a Cossack dance party on a speeding train, and some were probably just as unbelievable, but way more fun to repeat. Tales of his drunken debauches, his lecherous advances on society women and women of considerably less exalted status, his uncanny ability to secure promotions for allies and dismissals for enemies, all circulate with a speed and embellishment that only a city starved for scandal and simmering with discontent could provide. It's one thing for a peasant mystic to comfort a grieving mother. It's quite another for him to be perceived as influencing state policy, church appointments, and the very destiny of the empire. And this is precisely what many are beginning to believe. You see worried frowns on the faces of government ministers, men who have dedicated their lives to the service of the Tsar, now finding their carefully considered advice potentially overruled or undermined by the pronouncements of an illiterate Siberian peasant. The dignity of the state, the sanctity of the church, the very authority of the Tsar, all seem tainted by association with this increasingly notorious figure. One such figure of sober statesmanship was Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, a key reformer and a man of formidable will, viewed Rasputin with deep suspicion and actively tried to banish him from St. Petersburg. Stolypin, dedicated to modernizing Russia while preserving the monarchy, saw Rasputin as a dangerous charlatan whose influence was eroding the Tsar's credibility. He presented Nicholas with damning police reports detailing Rasputin's scandalous behavior, urging his removal. For a time, Rasputin was indeed compelled to leave the capital, perhaps undertaking another pilgrimage. But his connection to the Tsarina, her unshakable belief in his necessity for Alexei's survival, proved stronger than Stolypin's political clout. Rasputin always returned, his position often more entrenched than before. After Stolypin's assassination in 1911 at the Kiev Opera House, an event itself shrouded in conspiracy theories, Russia lost one of its most capable statesmen, and a powerful check on Rasputin's burgeoning influence vanished. Trying to get rid of Rasputin was like playing whack-a-mole with a particularly resilient, bearded mole who just kept popping up where you least expected him. Usually next to the Tsarina, the church hierarchy, too, is deeply divided. While some, like Bishop Hermogen of Saratov or the monk Iliador, initially championed Rasputin, they eventually turned against him, horrified by his conduct and his unorthodox pronouncements. They, like Stolypin, attempt to expose him, to warn the imperial couple, but their efforts are largely futile, often resulting in their own disgrace or banishment to distant monasteries. Alexandra, in particular, views any criticism of our friend as an attack on her faith, on her judgment as a mother, and even as a personal affront orchestrated by those who wish her and her family ill. Considerable discussion persists among academics regarding the precise moment Rasputin's influence transitioned from a private spiritual matter within the imperial family to a significant destabilizing factor in Russian politics and public perception. Was it when he first began to successfully recommend candidates for minor church positions, or when rumors of his influence over ministerial appointments began to solidify? Perhaps it was the moment the foreign press started to pick up on the salacious stories, painting a picture of a decadent, monk-ridden court that damaged Russia's image abroad. There's no single, universally agreed-upon point, but rather a gradual, creeping process, like a tide slowly eroding the foundations of a seaside cliff. You can sense the growing frustration within the Duma, Russia's nascent parliamentary body. Politicians like Alexander Guchkov, a conservative and a patriot, openly denounce Rasputin from the floor of the assembly, speaking of the dark forces surrounding the throne. His speeches are censored, but the words leak out, spreading through society, adding fuel to the fire of public discontent. The imperial family's approval ratings, if they'd had such a thing, would have been sinking faster than a leaky boat in a Siberian ice storm, with Rasputin cheerfully drilling more holes, metaphorically speaking, of course. He likely wasn't a keen boater. The unease is not confined to the political elite. Intellectuals, writers, and artists see in Rasputin a symbol of Russia's backwardness, a throwback to a superstitious past that they believed the country was slowly outgrowing. For them, his sway over the educated, German-born Tsarina is particularly galling, a sign of some deep sickness within the ruling class. Even among the devoutly religious peasantry, the class from which Rasputin himself sprang, there are mixed feelings. While some might still revere him as a holy man, others hear the scandalous tales and shake their heads, confused and disillusioned. The Tsar is supposed to be their little father, divinely guided and just. How can he allow such a man to be so close to him, so close to the Tsarina and the sacred heir? The seeds of doubt are indeed sprouting, and they are poisonous. Doubt in the Tsar's wisdom, doubt in the Tsarina's stability, doubt in the future of the Romanov dynasty, doubt in the very system of autocracy that has governed Russia for centuries. The trust that once bound the people to their Tsar, a trust based on faith, tradition, and a belief in the sacred nature of his office, is being steadily eroded. Each new story about Rasputin, each perceived instance of his inappropriate influence, acts like a corrosive acid on that bond. The dusk deepens. The street lamps of St. Petersburg cast long, wavering shadows. The wind carries whispers, rumors, and the distant, mournful sound of a foghorn from the Neva River. It feels as though the entire city, the entire empire, is holding its breath, waiting for something to break the oppressive tension. The imperial family, cocooned within their golden cage, surrounded by the adoring affirmations of their tiny circle, seem largely oblivious to the true extent of this darkening mood, or perhaps they choose to ignore it, dismissing it as the malice of their enemies. But the seeds have taken root in fertile ground, and the harvest, you sense, will be bitter indeed. The murder of an empire's trust is no longer a subtle, internal process. It's becoming a public spectacle, and the chief suspect, in the eyes of many, is the enigmatic peasant from Siberia. The dusk you observed settling over Russia now deepens into a more profound and pervasive gloom, as the vast machinery of the Russian Empire grinds its way into the crucible of the Great War. The year is 1914, and a wave of patriotic fervor, tinged with a grim determination, initially sweeps across the land. St. Petersburg is renamed Petrograd, a more Russian-sounding name, to shed its Germanic connotations. You see the flags, hear the marching bands, witness the tearful farewells as husbands, sons, and brothers are swallowed by the insatiable demands of the Eastern Front. But this initial burst of national unity is a fragile thing, easily fractured by the harsh realities of modern warfare, staggering casualties, incompetent leadership, and growing shortages on the home front. And it is within these wartime shadows that Grigori Rasputin's power, far from diminishing, paradoxically deepens and becomes more overt. The Tsar, Nicholas II, a man who feels the weight of his autocratic responsibility profoundly, makes a decision in August 1915 that will have far-reaching consequences. In August 1915, Tsar Nicholas II made the controversial decision to dismiss his cousin, Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, as commander-in-chief of the Russian army and take personal command himself, moving to Stavka military headquarters at Mogilev. Nicholas decided the best person to run the army was himself, which, given his previous track record with big decisions, made a lot of people nervous enough to start hoarding canned goods, or at least to shake their heads in dismay. He believed it was his sacred duty to be with his troops, to inspire them, to lead them as his ancestors had. While a noble sentiment, perhaps, it removed him from the day-to-day governance of the country in Petrograd, leaving a significant power vacuum. And who steps into that vacuum? Or rather, whose influence expands to fill it? Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna. With Nicholas away playing soldier, Alexandra was essentially in charge of domestic affairs, acting as his regent in all but name. Her already considerable reliance on our friend intensifies dramatically. She sees it as her duty to support her beloved husband, to keep the home front stable, and to ensure that true patriots are in positions of power. And who better to advise her on who is truly patriotic, who is truly loyal, who is truly God-fearing than Father Grigori? He becomes her unelected, highly unconventional chief of staff, whose main qualification was being our friend, and, in her eyes, God's messenger. You are now an unseen observer in Alexandra's private study in the Alexander Palace. The lamplight seems to burn later into the night. The scent of beeswax and old leather from the book-lined shelves mingles with the faint aroma of the incense Rasputin often favored. Piles of letters and official documents cover her desk. She corresponds daily with Nicholas at Stavka, her letters a torrent of affection, maternal anxiety for Alexei, who sometimes joins his father at headquarters, to Alexandra's constant worry, and increasingly, political advice heavily seasoned with Rasputin's opinions. Our friend begs you to be firm, she writes. He says Minister X is a bad man and must be removed. Or, Grigori has had a vision. We must appoint Y to this post. He is a God-fearing man who will serve you well. Rasputin is a frequent visitor, his comings and goings less discreet now. He might arrive in the evening, sit with Alexandra for hours, drinking tea, talking, praying. He offers her comfort, reassurance, and a steady stream of pronouncements on who is good, who is bad, who is loyal, who is a traitor. His criteria are often simplistic, based on personal likes and dislikes, or on whether an individual has shown him appropriate deference or sought his blessing. Rasputin's military advice, if he gave any, probably involved more prayer and less strategic troop movements. Have the soldiers try a nice herbal tea before battle. Alyona might have been one of his less successful suggestions for winning the war. Thankfully, his direct military meddling seems limited. The actual extent of Rasputin's direct impact on military strategy or high-level wartime decisions versus his influence primarily being confined to domestic appointments and creating an atmosphere of instability remains a point of contention for those studying the period. While he likely didn't draw up battle plans, his ability to influence the appointment and dismissal of ministers, including those responsible for war supplies and domestic order, undoubtedly had a detrimental effect on the overall war effort and the stability of the government. This period becomes known, scathingly, as ministerial leapfrog. Competent, experienced ministers are dismissed if they fall foul of Rasputin or his circle, or if they dare to criticize his influence. They are replaced by a succession of often incompetent, sometimes corrupt, individuals whose primary qualification is the approval of our friend. The government becomes a revolving door of mediocrities, leading to administrative chaos, exacerbating shortages, and further fueling public discontent. Each new appointment, perceived as Rasputin's doing, hammers another nail into the coffin of the monarchy's credibility. You can imagine the despair of loyal officials, the fury of Duma politicians, the bewilderment of foreign allies. Russia, a vast empire struggling under the immense strain of total war, appears to be governed by the whims of a mystical peasant filtered through a devoutly religious but politically naive Tsarina. The wartime shadows provide a cloak for this bizarre state of affairs, with the Tsar at the front, focused on military matters, and with censorship and patriotic fervor initially suppressing open dissent. Rasputin's influence flourishes in the relative darkness of the domestic political scene. The stories about him grow ever more lurid, ever more damaging. Whispers of his control over Alexandra are now shouted as accusations. Rumors largely unfounded, but widely believed of a sexual relationship between Rasputin and the Tsarina, and even with her daughters, circulate, poisoning the image of the imperial family beyond repair. He is no longer just a curious holy man or a meddlesome healer. He is the dark force, the evil genius, the man who is destroying Russia from within. He is accused of being a German spy, ironic, given the Tsarina's German birth, which already made her a target for such accusations. The fact that he often spoke out against the war, or at least expressed a desire for peace, was twisted into evidence of his treachery. The trust that the Russian people, and particularly the educated and political classes, had in their government is not just eroded, it's collapsing. How can you trust a government that appears to be run by a charlatan? How can you trust a czar who allows this to happen? The sacrifices demanded by the war, the lives lost, the economic hardship become unbearable when coupled with the perception that the country is being mismanaged and betrayed from the very top, all due to the malign influence of one man over a susceptible empress. The wartime shadows are indeed dark. They conceal the full extent of the rot for a time, but they also allow it to fester and grow. The absence of the Tsar, the anxieties of the Tsarina, the pressures of a devastating war, all create the perfect storm for Rasputin's power to reach its zenith. And as his power grows, so too does the determination of those who believe that for Russia to survive, for the monarchy itself to be saved, Grigori Rasputin must be removed. Permanently, the stage is being set for a dramatic and violent confrontation, a desperate attempt to cut out the perceived cancer before it consumes the entire body politic. The empire's trust is not just murdered, its corpse is now being paraded through the streets, and the murmurs of revolution are growing louder than the cannons at the front. The wartime shadows you witnessed enveloping Petrograd now seem to seep into the very stone of its grand government buildings, creating an atmosphere of bewildering instability. With Tsar Nicholas still largely absent at Stavka, wrestling with military maps and the immense pressures of command, the domestic levers of power are increasingly and erratically manipulated through the Tsarina, and by extension, through Grigori Rasputin. You find yourself a silent observer in the cold, echoing corridors of ministries where the scent of floor polish and old paper can't quite mask the underlying aroma of fear and uncertainty. This is the era of the ministerial merry-go-round, a chaotic period where accusations of Rasputin's meddling in state affairs are no longer whispered in hushed tones, but are becoming a bitter, public outcry. Imagine the scene: a new minister, perhaps a man of some talent and integrity, arrives at his post, determined to tackle the monumental challenges facing a nation at war. He sets about learning the ropes, issuing directives, trying to bring some order to the chaos. Then, a few months, sometimes only weeks, later, he might make a decision that displeases our friend, or fail to pay sufficient homage to Rasputin's circle, or simply find himself on the wrong side of an opinion expressed by Alexandra after one of her long, prayerful consultations. Suddenly, inexplicably to him, he is dismissed. His office is cleared out, his plans half-formed, his subordinates left bewildered. Government ministers were changing so fast, they barely had time to find the good stationery, let alone learn their jobs. It was like a game of musical chairs, but with the fate of an empire at stake, and the music was being called by someone who many believed shouldn't even be in the ballroom. The sheer scale of this instability is staggering. Between September 1915 and February 1917, when the revolution began, Russia had 4 different prime ministers, chairmen of the Council of Ministers, 5 ministers of internal affairs, 3 ministers of war, and 3 ministers of foreign affairs, demonstrating the extreme instability. This wasn't just a minor reshuffle, it was a wholesale gutting of governmental continuity. Each change brought disruption, a loss of institutional memory, and a deepening sense of crisis. Critical departments responsible for food supply, transportation, and internal order, all vital during wartime, were thrown into disarray. You can almost hear the grinding of the gears of state as they seize up, starved of consistent direction and competent leadership. The main job requirement for a minister seemed to be, Rasputin thinks he's a decent chap, which wasn't exactly a rigorous vetting process. Previous experience in, say, governing was entirely optional. Men like Alexei Khvostov, a virulent reactionary, was appointed Minister of the Interior, allegedly after boasting he would crush the revolution and deal with Rasputin, though he later fell out with the mystic. Then there was Boris Sturmer, an elderly, widely distrusted bureaucrat of German descent, who at one point held the posts of Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and Minister of the Interior simultaneously, a concentration of power in the hands of a man many suspected of incompetence and even pro-German sympathies, all supposedly with Rasputin's blessing. His appointment caused outrage. The precise mechanisms by which Rasputin's preferences were translated into actual ministerial appointments, whether through direct suggestion, Alexandra's interpretation of his ambiguous utterances, or Anna Vyrobova's facilitation, are still dissected by those examining the period's inner workings. Did Rasputin sit down with a list and say, Alyona, hire this one, fire that one? Probably not so blatantly, or at least not always. More likely, he would speak in parables, express feelings about certain individuals, praise those who flattered him, and condemn those who slighted him or represented a threat. The Tsarina, desperate for divine guidance and convinced of his holiness, would interpret these pronouncements as God's will, pressuring the Tsar in her voluminous letters to act accordingly. Anna Vyrubova, ever the devoted go-between, would reinforce these messages, ensuring that Rasputin's desires were clearly understood. You see the impact of this on the morale of the civil service, on the functioning of the Duma. How can one govern effectively when the ground is constantly shifting beneath one's feet? How can long-term plans be made, or difficult reforms implemented, when the minister in charge today might be gone tomorrow, replaced by someone with entirely different ideas, or no ideas at all? The average Russian citizen trying to figure out who was in charge felt like they needed a flowchart, a strong cup of tea, and possibly a seer of their own just to keep track. The newspapers, heavily censored as they were, still managed to hint at the chaos, and satirical journals, though often suppressed, found ways to lampoon the dark forces and the ministerial musical chairs. The accusations of meddling are no longer just coming from disgruntled politicians or jealous courtiers. They are being voiced by members of the imperial family itself, by grand dukes who write desperate letters to the Tsar, pleading with him to see reason, to remove Alexandra from political influence, and to banish Rasputin. Even the Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, Nicholas's own mother, expresses her profound alarm. But Nicholas, isolated at Stavka, worn down by the war and by his wife's insistent, emotionally charged appeals, often vacillates or digs in his heels, viewing any criticism of Alexandra or Rasputin as a personal attack or a sign of disloyalty. The trust in the Tsar's ability to govern, already damaged, is now shattered for many. He appears either blind, weak, or completely enthralled by his wife and her spiritual guide. The sacred aura of the autocracy is dissolving in a mire of incompetence, cronyism, and perceived corruption. Each new inexplicable appointment, each dismissal of a capable man, reinforces the narrative that Russia is not being governed, but is adrift, its rudder controlled by unseen, unqualified hands in the dimly lit private rooms of the palace. Imagine the scene in the Duma. Deputies, elected representatives, however limited their actual power, try to debate policy, to address the urgent needs of a country bleeding from war and internal strife. But what is the point when their resolutions can be ignored, their ministers dismissed, their efforts thwarted by a shadowy influence that operates outside all constitutional or legal frameworks? Frustration turns to anger, then to despair, and finally, for some, to a grim determination that the entire system must be swept away. The damage to the war effort is also palpable. The disorganization in ministries responsible for supplying the army with munitions, food, and clothing leads to shortages at the front, undermining the morale of the soldiers. Stories of troops lacking rifles, of rampant corruption in war contracts, filter back, further enraging a populace already making enormous sacrifices, and who is blamed, not just the individual incompetent ministers, but the system that allows them to be appointed, the system that seems to prioritize personal loyalty to a mystic over national survival. The ministerial merry-go-round is more than just a symptom of decay. It is an active agent in the murder of the empire's trust. It demonstrates, in the most public and undeniable way, that the leadership of the country has become detached from reality, incapable of effective governance, and deaf to the rising clamor of its people. The accusations of Rasputin's meddling are no longer mere accusations. They are, in the eyes of millions, the undeniable truth explaining the nation's woes. And as the carousel of ministers spins ever more wildly, the entire edifice of the Romanov dynasty lurches closer to the abyss. The dull thud of another dismissed minister's career hitting the cobblestones is becoming the dreary soundtrack to an empire's decline. The chaotic spinning of the ministerial merry-go-round leaves you, and indeed much of Petrograd, dizzy and disoriented, as if the tangible political instability weren't enough to fray the nerves of an empire at war. Another, more ethereal layer of unease settles upon the city. The growing influence of Grigori Rasputin's prophecies and pronouncements. The lamplight in those exclusive salons and private imperial chambers now often illuminates scenes of hushed expectation as anxious faces turn towards the Siberian peasant, awaiting words they believe might hold the key to the future, or at least to surviving the increasingly terrifying present. There's a dark allure to his utterances, a magnetic pull for souls adrift in a sea of uncertainty, and a corresponding panic when his words paint a future filled with shadows. You observe Rasputin in these moments. Sometimes he appears to fall into a trance-like state, his eyes rolling back, his voice taking on a strange, distant timbre as he delivers cryptic warnings or reassurances. Other times, he'll offer his insights with a disarming, almost casual simplicity, perhaps over a glass of sweet Madeira, his pronouncements landing with the blunt force of peasant wisdom. To what degree Rasputin genuinely believed in his own prophetic abilities, as opposed to shrewdly exploiting the credulity of his followers and the anxieties of the era, remains an unresolved question among his biographers. Was he a true seer, touched by some otherworldly perception, a remarkably intuitive psychologist, or a cunning charlatan with an uncanny knack for saying what his audience needed or feared to hear? Perhaps he was a bewildering cocktail of all three. His prophetic accuracy was a bit like a stopped clock, occasionally right, but you wouldn't want to set your watch by it, or, say, your empire's entire domestic policy. Yet, in the supercharged atmosphere of wartime Petrograd, where every rumor was magnified and every setback felt like a step closer to the abyss, his words carried enormous weight, especially within the imperial family's inner sanctum. Tsarina Alexandra, in particular, clung to his prophecies. If he predicted a turn for the better in Alexei's health or success in a particular endeavor, she would be buoyed, her faith in him reaffirmed. If he spoke of dark clouds on the horizon or warned of traitors and enemies, her anxieties would intensify, her resolve to protect her family and heed our friend's guidance hardening. One of the most significant areas for his pronouncements was, naturally, the war itself. Rasputin often made predictions about the war, sometimes optimistic, sometimes dire, which Alexandra would relay to Nicholas at the front. Our friend says our brave soldiers will soon have a great victory, she might write, filling the Tsar with a flicker of hope amidst the grim realities of Stavka. Or, conversely, Grigori had a terrible dream. He saw much blood. He says we must be cautious and pray harder. Such messages, arriving with the imperial courier, must have been a strange and unsettling addition to the military briefings Nicholas received from his generals. Some of his visions sounded suspiciously like common sense wrapped in spooky peasant wisdom, like don't eat yellow snow, but for geopolitical strategy, vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways, yet specific enough to feel profound if events happened to align. When Rasputin cleared his throat to speak, you could hear a pin drop in those hushed rooms, mostly because people were terrified he was about to predict their favorite dog would run away, or that their investments in turnip futures were doomed. His pronouncements weren't limited to grand matters of state or war. He'd offer insights into personal affairs, predict the outcome of social disputes, or warn individuals of impending misfortune or illness. If these predictions came true, as they sometimes did by chance or through canny observation, his legend grew. If they failed, they were often forgotten or rationalized away. Perhaps the prayers hadn't been fervent enough, or the individual hadn't followed his advice precisely. The dark allure of these prophecies lay in their ability to offer simple, definitive answers in a world that had become overwhelmingly complex and terrifying for Alexandra and her circle, besieged by criticism, racked with anxiety for Alexei and for Russia. Rasputin's confident assertions cut through the noise and doubt like a beacon, however flawed. He offered them a narrative, a sense of meaning, a belief that God was still communicating, still guiding them through this unlikely vessel. This reliance on prophetic utterance, however, further distanced them from the rational, often grim, assessments of their official advisors. Why listen to a minister's tedious report on grain shortages when Father Grigori has had a vision of a bountiful harvest? If only the right prayers are said and the right meaning, his approved officials are in place. But as these prophecies and pronouncements leaked out beyond the palace walls, and they always did, carried by servants, by disillusioned former members of the circle, by the ever-active society gossips, they induced not comfort, but panic and derision. The idea that the fate of the empire might hinge on the dreams and visions of a debauched Siberian peasant was horrifying to many. It confirmed their worst fears that the autocracy was no longer guided by reason or by a sane assessment of Russia's needs, but by superstition and the whims of a madman, or at least a very manipulative one. Consider the famous, though perhaps apocryphal or later embellished, prophecy he is said to have made regarding his own demise, that if he were killed by commoners, the Tsar had nothing to fear. But if nobles were his assassins, then the imperial family would perish within 2 years, and the Russian nobility would be scattered to the winds. While the full impact of this specific prophecy would only be felt posthumously, it's indicative of the kind of weighty, doom-laden pronouncements he was capable of making. Such words, even if not widely known at the time, contributed to the mystique and the fear that surrounded him. He wasn't just meddling, he was, in the eyes of some, toying with the very destiny of Russia, weaving a dark enchantment around the throne. The panic induced by his influence was tangible. It fueled a sense of impending catastrophe. Educated society felt a profound sense of shame and frustration. How had Russia, a great European power, come to this? How could the Tsar and Tsarina be so blind? The trust that the populace might have had in a divinely guided autocrat was replaced by a chilling fear that the autocrat was being guided by dark, irrational forces. This wasn't just incompetence. This felt like a spiritual sickness at the heart of the empire. The atmosphere in Petrograd grows heavier, the shadows longer. Each new rumor of a Rasputin prophecy, each fresh piece of evidence of his sway over the Tsarina, adds to the oppressive sense that the country is hurtling towards disaster. The rational discourse of politics, already strained by war and incompetence, is further undermined by this infusion of mysticism and fatalism. The murder of an empire's trust is accelerated by this surrender to the prophetic. as it suggests a leadership that has abandoned reason and embraced the occult, leaving the citizens to face a future dictated not by sound policy, but by the opaque visions of a man many considered a charlatan or a demon. The allure of easy answers had a terrifyingly high price. The dark allure of Rasputin's prophecies and his pervasive influence on state affairs, as you've seen, cast a long, chilling shadow over Petrograd. Now, you turn your attention to a specific segment of this anxious city, the Russian nobility, the very bedrock of the autocracy, or so they had always believed. The lamplight in their grand, ancestral palaces on the Moika or the Fontanka canals now illuminates not just glittering balls or idle chatter, but faces etched with a new, grim resolve. Their initial disdain for the mujik, who had captivated the empress, has curdled into a potent brew of fear and resentment. They see Rasputin's influence as a poisoned chalice presented to the imperial family, from which the entire nation is now being forced to drink, and the effects are proving devastating. You witness a distinct shift in their drawing rooms and private clubs. The Russian aristocracy, who usually spent their time debating the merits of French poetry or whose wolfhounds were fastest, suddenly found a common enemy, a peasant who'd crashed their very exclusive, centuries-old party and simply refused to leave, instead rearranging the furniture and picking the music. What began as society gossip and offended sensibilities has morphed into a genuine patriotic terror. They see their Tsar, their divinely appointed sovereign, mesmerized, their Tsarina, once a figure of remote dignity, now perceived as a puppet. They see the ancient institutions of Russia, the church, the state, the army being undermined, their own traditional roles and influence eroding daily. Leading figures among them, men of proud lineage and considerable wealth, begin to voice their concerns with increasing urgency. You hear their exasperated conversations, the clinking of wine glasses accompanying muttered condemnations of that dreadful man and the German woman he controls. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's own cousin, a dashing young man beloved in society, and Prince Felix Yusupov, the fabulously wealthy heir to one of Russia's greatest fortunes and married to the Tsar's niece, Princess Irina Alexandrovna, are among those who feel this disgrace most acutely. They represent a generation of nobility that, while perhaps not always politically astute, possessed a strong sense of honor and a deep-seated loyalty to the idea of the monarchy, if not always to its current occupants' choices. They try, you observe, the conventional methods first. They seek audiences with the Tsar, hoping to appeal to his reason, to his sense of duty. They speak to influential relatives, to members of the imperial family closer to Nicholas, like his mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, or his sister, Grand Duchess Xenia Alexandrovna, who herself is deeply troubled. These matriarchs, in turn, attempt to sway Nicholas, to make him see the precipice upon which the dynasty stands. But trying to convince Nicholas that Rasputin was bad news was like trying to tell a man his prize-winning talking dog was actually just a very clever parrot wearing a fur coat. He just wasn't buying it. Or rather, Alexandra's counter-arguments, her passionate defenses of our friend, always seemed to win the day. The Tsar, isolated and defensive, often views their warnings as interference, as disloyalty, or as a failure to understand the unique spiritual comfort Rasputin provides. The frustration is palpable. These are men and women accustomed to being heard, to having their opinions valued. Now, they find themselves shut out, their access to the throne blocked by this inexplicable peasant. The doors of the Alexander Palace, once open to them, now feel guarded by an invisible barrier of suspicion and Rasputin-approved piety. Their options were running out. They'd tried petitions, stern looks, strongly worded letters, and probably even some very pointedly uninvitations to social events they knew Rasputin might try to crash. Nothing worked. He remained a fixture, an unmovable, unbearable presence. Assessing the true depth and breadth of anti-Rasputin sentiment among the wider Russian nobility, beyond the vocal critics and eventual conspirators, presents a challenge for historians relying on often biased contemporary accounts. While some were undoubtedly driven by genuine patriotic concern, others may have been motivated by jealousy of Rasputin's influence, by thwarted personal ambitions, or by a simple snobbish distaste for his peasant origins and uncouth manners. Yet, the chorus of condemnation was growing too loud to ignore, even if the Tsar and Tsarina chose to do so. You see small groups beginning to gather in secret, the lamplight low, the conversations hushed and intense. The names Yusupov and Dmitry Pavlovich are frequently mentioned. They are joined by others, like Vladimir Purishkevich, an arch-conservative, even reactionary, politician, but a fierce patriot and an outspoken critic of Rasputin in the Duma. His bombastic speeches denouncing the dark forces have already made him a public figure in the anti-Rasputin camp. He brings a certain political weight and perhaps a more ruthless pragmatism to their aristocratic outrage. The poisoned chalice metaphor becomes increasingly apt. They believe Rasputin is not just an embarrassment, not just a source of bad advice, but a genuine spiritual poison corrupting the soul of Russia, weakening its moral fiber, and inviting divine retribution in the form of military defeat and internal collapse. For men steeped in Orthodox faith and monarchist tradition, this is a terrifying prospect. They feel a desperate need to act, to lance the boil, to excise the sickness before it kills the patient being Mother Russia herself. The fear is not just for the country, but also for themselves. If the monarchy falls, what becomes of the nobility? Their privileges, their way of life, their very existence are tied to the survival of the Tsarist regime. And they see Rasputin as the catalyst for its potential downfall. He is handing the revolutionaries their greatest propaganda weapon on a silver platter. The trust the people once had in the Tsar is being systematically destroyed by this one man's unprecedented access and influence. They, the nobility, who consider themselves the traditional guardians of the throne, feel a desperate responsibility to intervene where the Tsar himself has failed to act. The chill of the Petrograd winter seems to seep into these clandestine meetings. Snow falls softly outside the frosted windows, muffling the sounds of the city, creating an insulated, conspiratorial atmosphere. Plots are discussed, discarded, refined. How does one remove a man so closely protected by the Empress? A man who seems to possess an almost supernatural ability to survive and thrive. The discussions are no longer about petitions or political maneuvering. A darker, more desperate solution begins to take shape in their minds. The chalice of Rasputin's influence is indeed poisoned, and they are beginning to believe that the only way to save the dynasty is to dash it from his hands, violently and permanently. The seeds of assassination are being sown in the fertile ground of their fear and resentment. The trust in their sovereign to manage his own house has utterly collapsed, and they are preparing to take that management upon themselves. The fear and resentment you witnessed simmering amongst the Petrograd nobility have now reached a boiling point, a desperate crescendo against the backdrop of a relentlessly bleak Russian winter. The air in the city is not just freezing, it's thick with unspoken anxieties and the furtive energy of conspiracy. You find yourself drawn into the very heart of this dangerous undertaking, a silent observer as a plot, born of patriotic desperation and aristocratic outrage, takes shape in the dimly lit, opulent rooms of palaces far removed from the Tsarina's cloistered faith. The lamplight here casts long, dancing shadows, reflecting in the worried eyes of men who have decided that the only way to cleanse the poisoned chalice is to shatter it, regardless of the consequences. It's a motley crew. This band of would-be saviors, a prince, a grand duke, a fiery politician, a doctor, and an army officer. Sounds like the beginning of a rather grim joke. But their intent is deadly serious, if their subsequent execution of the plan proves a tad unconventional. At the center of it all is Prince Felix Yusupov, young, impossibly wealthy, and married to the Tsar's own niece. His Moika Palace, a stunning edifice on the banks of the frozen river, becomes the clandestine headquarters for their deadly enterprise. You see him, a figure of almost decadent elegance, his youthful face now hardened by a grim purpose. He believes, with a fervent conviction that mirrors the Tsarina's devotion to Rasputin, that he is destined to rid Russia of this evil. Closely allied with him is Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin, a young man who had once been a favorite of Nicholas and Alexandra, now finds himself an outcast due to his open disapproval of Rasputin. His involvement lends a veneer of dynastic legitimacy to their actions, or so they hope. He is driven by a sense of sullied family honor and a fear for the Romanov legacy. Then there is Vladimir Purishkevich, the right-wing Duma deputy, a man whose booming voice and theatrical denunciations of Rasputin have already echoed through the halls of the Tauride Palace. He is less about aristocratic finesse and more about decisive, if brutal, action. These three form the core, their shared belief that they are patriots, not murderers, steeling their resolve. Their planning sessions are intense, often fraught with argument and uncertainty, yet underscored by a shared sense of urgency. You imagine them huddled around a heavy mahogany table in Yusupov's study, the curtains drawn tight against the swirling snow outside. The air is thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive brandy, a stark contrast to the holy incense that permeates Alexandra's meetings with Rasputin. They discuss methods. Poison seems the most discreet, the most fitting for a man they consider a venomous influence. Cyanide, potent enough to fell an ox, is procured. The plot to murder Rasputin was primarily hatched by Prince Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and Vladimir Purishkevich. They were later joined by Army officer Sergei Sukhotin and Dr. Stanislaus de Lazovert, who was tasked with obtaining and perhaps administering the poison. Their plan, as it evolves, has more holes than a block of Swiss cheese left out for target practice. But they were driven by a kind of patriotic desperation that overlooked minor details like, what if he doesn't actually die easily from enough poison to kill several men? Yusupov is to lure Rasputin to the Moika Palace late one night, under the pretext of meeting his beautiful wife, Princess Irina, whom Rasputin has expressed a desire to meet, though Irina herself will be conveniently absent in the Crimea. A suite of basement rooms is prepared, soundproofed, and made cozy with a bearskin rug and a gramophone, all to set a relaxed, unsuspecting scene for the deadly encounter. You feel the crushing weight of the secret they carry. Trying to keep a secret like, "We're going to murder the Empress's bestie" in gossip-fueled Petrograd was like trying to hide an elephant in a teacup. Someone was bound to notice the trunk sticking out, or in this case, the nervous glances and hushed conversations. The city is a tinderbox of rumors, and their own erratic behavior, their sudden secretive meetings, must surely arouse some suspicion. Yet, they press on, convinced that the risk is necessary, that they are acting in Russia's best interest, perhaps even to save the Tsar from himself. The exact roles and level of commitment of each individual involved in the conspiracy leading up to the final night, particularly some of the more peripheral figures, are points over which historical accounts still offer some minor variations. Yusupov, in his later memoirs, paints himself as the primary architect and executioner. Purishkevich, in his diary, also claims a leading role. Grand Duke Dmitri's involvement seems more hesitant at times, perhaps troubled by the gravity of regicide's shadow, even if the target is not the Tsar himself, but his intimate. Dr. Lazavert's role with the poison is crucial, yet his nerve might falter. Lieutenant Sukhotin provides a military presence, perhaps a steadying hand, or simply another body committed to the deed. The date is set for mid-December 1916. The Petrograd winter is at its fiercest. The canals are frozen solid, the streets blanketed in deep snow. The city is gripped by war weariness, food shortages, and an ever-present sense of impending crisis. For the conspirators, the freezing air itself seems to reflect their chilling resolve. There's a sense of an approaching climax, a feeling that the drama that has held the capital in its thrall for so long is about to reach its violent, inevitable conclusion. You observe their preparations, the acquiring of the cyanide, the choosing of the cakes and wine to be laced with it, the discussions about how to dispose of the body. There's a morbid, almost theatrical quality to their plotting, a sense of men playing roles in a grand, tragic opera of their own devising. They are amateurs in the art of assassination, driven more by passion and a sense of aristocratic entitlement than by cold, professional calculation. This very amateurism, you sense, will make the actual event far more chaotic and horrifying than they anticipate. The trust they once placed in the Tsar to protect the realm, to uphold the dignity of the crown, has completely and utterly disintegrated. They are now taking the law, and indeed the fate of a man's life, into their own hands. It is the ultimate act of defiance, a desperate gamble that by removing the source of all evil, they can somehow reset the course of history, save the monarchy from its own folly, and restore a semblance of order and sanity to a Russia teetering on the brink of revolution. The plot conceived in the freezing Petrograd air is a desperate, last-ditch effort by a dying class to reclaim control, a tragic testament to the comprehensive murder of an empire's trust, a murder in which they are now about to become very active, very literal participants. The silence of the snow-covered city seems to wait, holding its breath for the events that are about to unfold in the warm, lamplit rooms of the Moika Palace. The biting Petrograd winter night of December 16, 1916. Old style feels colder and more ominous than any before it. You are an unseen presence within the magnificent Moika Palace, the ancestral home of Prince Felix Yusupov, where the carefully laid, if somewhat amateurish, plot to eliminate Grigori Rasputin is about to unfold. The lamplight, within the sumptuously decorated basement rooms, specially prepared for this night, casts a deceptively warm glow, glinting off gilded furnishings and the crystal wine glasses that hold a deadly secret. The air is thick with unspoken tension, the scent of fear mingling with the sweet aroma of pastries and the rich bouquet of Madeira wine. You observe Prince Yusupov, a young man usually known for his charm and aesthetic pursuits, now a bundle of nerves beneath a veneer of forced calm. He awaits his guest, the man he believes is the Antichrist of Russia. Upstairs, the other conspirators, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Vladimir Purishkevich, Dr. Lazovert, and Lieutenant Sukhotin, wait in anxious anticipation, their ears straining for any sound from below. Yusupov trying to make small talk with them, perhaps fiddling with the gramophone set to play Yankee Doodle to signal success. Must have been an Oscar-worthy performance in strained nonchalance. Then, Rasputin arrives, a burly, bearded figure exuding his usual strange charisma, his penetrating eyes taking in the scene. He's been lured here on the pretext of meeting Yusupov's famously beautiful wife, Princess Tsarina. Grigori Rasputin was lured to the Moika Palace on the pretext of meeting Prince Felix Yusupov's wife, Princess Tsarina. He was fed cakes and wine laced with potassium cyanide, which, according to Yusupov, initially seemed to have no effect. You watch as Yusupov offers his guest the poisoned petit fours, pink and chocolate, and pours him glasses of the cyanide-laced Madeira. Rasputin, it said, initially declines the cakes, perhaps suspicious, or simply not hungry. Then he relents, eating one, then another, and another. He drinks the wine. An agonizing wait ensues. Yusupov, a bundle of frayed nerves, plays his guitar, sings folk songs, anything to pass the time, anything to appear normal while expecting his guest to collapse at any moment. The cyanide, supposedly enough to kill several men almost instantly, seems to be having no discernible effect. Rasputin chats, boasts of his influence, perhaps even offers some of his cryptic pronouncements. Apparently, Rasputin's constitution was tougher than a Siberian winter, or perhaps Dr. Lazovert, in his agitation, had accidentally bought potassium light, the diet version of deadly poison, or the poison had somehow degraded. The tension in the room becomes almost unbearable. Yusupov excuses himself, rushes upstairs in a panic to confer with his co-conspirators. Their expressions, you imagine, shift from nervous anticipation to bewildered horror. What now? The decision is made if poison won't work. A bullet must. Yusupov returns to the basement, this time armed with Grand Duke Dmitry's Browning revolver. He finds Rasputin still very much alive, perhaps a little drowsy, or maybe even more animated, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. After a few more strained moments, Yusupov, steeling his resolve, takes aim at Rasputin's chest and fires. The sound of the shot, even muffled by the basement walls, must have been deafening in the confined space. Rasputin roars, stumbles, and falls to the bearskin rug. A collective sigh of relief from upstairs. The conspirators rush down. Dr. Lazovert pronounces Rasputin dead. It seems their desperate act is done. They begin to discuss the disposal of the body. Grand Duke Dmitry, perhaps unnerved by the violence, leaves the palace. Purishkevich, Yusupov, and the others remain, adrenaline still coursing through them. But the night of horrors is far from over, as Yusupov, in a moment of morbid curiosity or lingering disbelief, bends over the supposedly lifeless body. Rasputin's eyes snap open. They are, Yusupov would later claim, filled with a demonic fury. With a guttural cry, the dead man leaps to his feet, foam on his lips, and lunges at Yusupov, tearing one of his epaulets. He then stumbles towards the door leading to the courtyard, roaring Yusupov's name, intent on escape. The scene descends into sheer pandemonium. Their initial plan for a quiet, dignified poisoning had gone out the window and was now running screaming down the street, replaced by a rather more direct and brutal approach to problem-solving. Rasputin, fueled by an almost supernatural strength or sheer terror, makes it out into the snow-covered courtyard, shouting for help. Purishkevich, a man of action if nothing else, grabs a revolver and gives chase. He fires once, misses. He fires again, hitting Rasputin in the back. A third shot, and Rasputin stumbles. A fourth, some say to the head, and the formidable peasant finally crashes to the ground, silent at last, near a snowdrift. The exact sequence of events during Rasputin's murder, particularly regarding the efficacy of the poison and the number and timing of the shots fired, remains somewhat muddled due to the conflicting and often self-aggrandizing testimonies of the conspirators themselves. Each participant, in later years, would offer slightly different versions, perhaps to enhance their own role or to process the trauma of that brutal night. What is undeniable is the sheer, savage violence of it all. The chilling resolve is now not just Rasputin's incredible tenacity for life, but the grim, almost frenzied determination of his assassins to finish what they started. You can imagine their blood-soaked state, their exhaustion, their terror mixed with a grim satisfaction. They have killed the monster, but they have done so in a way that is monstrous in itself. The basement room is a wreck, stained with blood and wine. The courtyard is a scene of carnage under the cold, indifferent gaze of the winter moon. The remaining conspirators now face the urgent, gruesome task of disposing of the body. They retrieve Rasputin's corpse, bind it with ropes, and drive it through the deserted, snow-swept streets of Petrograd to the Petrovsky Bridge. There, in the freezing darkness, they heave his lifeless form through a hole in the ice into the Neva River's frigid embrace. They hope the current will carry him out to sea, his disappearance perhaps attributed to an accident or a flight from the city. But even in this, they are clumsy. Rasputin's heavy fur coat, it's said, initially keeps the body afloat, or perhaps it snags on a bridge piling. One of his galoshes is left on the bridge, a telltale clue. The attempt at a discreet, untraceable disposal is as flawed as their initial poisoning plan. As dawn approaches, casting a gray, unforgiving light over Petrograd, the conspirators disperse, shaken and stained by the night's work. They believed they were acting as saviors, as surgeons cutting out a cancer. But the night at the Moika Palace was not a clean incision. It was a brutal, messy butchery. The chilling resolve that drove them to murder has left them with blood on their hands and a secret that will soon explode into a national scandal, further destabilizing an empire already on the verge of collapse. The trust they sought to restore by this violent act is unlikely to be resurrected from the icy waters of the Neva. The brutal, chaotic night at the Moika Palace fades into the gray, unforgiving dawn over Petrograd. The conspirators have dispersed, leaving behind them a trail of blood, bungled plans, and the heavy silence of a deed done. You, however, remain an observer as the city slowly, almost reluctantly, awakens to the consequences of their chilling resolve. The Neva River, beneath its thick mantle of ice, holds its secret, but not for long. Rasputin, even in death, seemed determined to make a dramatic reappearance. He wasn't one for a quiet exit. Clearly, it takes a couple of days. Whispers of Rasputin's disappearance begin to circulate. The Tsarina, you learn, is frantic. Our friend has vanished. He was expected at the palace, or Anna Virubova was expecting to hear from him. His absence is a gaping wound in her already anxious existence. Police inquiries begin, discreetly at first, then with increasing urgency as Alexandra's panic grows. The clues inevitably lead towards the Moika Palace, the last place Rasputin was reportedly seen, the dropped galosh on the Petrovsky Bridge, the telltale signs of a struggle or unusual activity noted by Yusupov's own servants or suspicious policemen. Then, on December 19th, old style, the frozen reckoning arrives. Rasputin's body was recovered from the Malaya Nevka River, near the Petrovsky Bridge. Imagine the scene: burly policemen, their breath misting in the frigid air, hauling a grotesque, ice-encrusted shape from a hole cut in the river's thick crust. His famous fur coat is soaked and heavy, his hair and beard matted with ice and frozen blood. His arms, it's later said, are frozen in an upward position, as if he were trying to make the sign of the cross, or perhaps claw his way out from under the ice. The autopsy, when it's performed, reveals a catalog of horrors: bullet wounds, evidence of a savage beating, and, most chillingly, water in his lungs, suggesting he was still alive, however faintly, when he was plunged into that icy tomb. The discovery sends a shockwave through Petrograd. The stunned silence that initially greets the news of his disappearance is now replaced by a cacophony of hushed speculation, morbid curiosity, and, in many quarters, a poorly concealed sense of relief, or even triumph. The city, which had lived under the shadow of his influence for so long, now has tangible proof of his demise. His end was as lurid and dramatic as his life. The investigation into his murder begins, but it's an investigation unlike any other. The primary suspects are not common criminals, but a prince of the Yusupov dynasty, a grand duke of the imperial blood, and a prominent member of the Duma. The investigation proceeded with all the speed and efficiency of a tortoise wading through molasses, especially when it became clear who was holding the smoking guns, or at least whose palace had been the crime scene. The degree to which the official investigation into Rasputin's murder was deliberately hampered or steered by high-ranking officials sympathetic to the conspirators' motives or fearful of implicating members of the imperial family is a subject that still generates considerable academic discussion. There are orders from on high, it seems, to tread carefully. The Tsar himself is in a terrible position. His wife's spiritual guide, a man he had tolerated and even sometimes trusted, has been brutally murdered, and the assassins are members of his own extended family and the elite he is sworn to lead. You witness the reactions within the Alexander Palace. Tsarina Alexandra is beyond grief. She is incandescent with rage and despair. To her, this is not the removal of a corrupting influence, but the murder of a saint, a man of God, by decadent, godless aristocrats. Her worst fears about the treachery surrounding the throne are confirmed. She demands justice, swift and harsh. Her already fragile emotional state deteriorates further. She isolates herself, her belief in the wickedness of the Petrograd elite and the purity of our friend, now unshakable. calcified by this ultimate betrayal. Tsar Nicholas, when he returns from Stavka, is faced with an almost impossible dilemma. He is torn between his wife's anguished demands for retribution, his own complex feelings about Rasputin, and the undeniable status of the murderers. He cannot simply execute his own cousin and one of the wealthiest princes in the land without causing an even greater scandal and potentially alienating what little support he has left among the nobility. His eventual decision is a compromise that satisfies no one. Grand Duke Dmitry is exiled to military service in Persia, a move that, ironically, would save his life from the coming revolution. And Prince Yusupov is banished to his provincial estates. Purishkevich, already at the front as head of a hospital train, largely escapes immediate official punishment, protected perhaps by his Duma immunity and his vocal patriotism. Dr. Lazavert and Lieutenant Sukhotin also seem to fade into the background with minimal formal consequences. It is a far cry from the justice Alexandra craved. Meanwhile, Petrograd processes the news. In the grand salons of the nobility, there's a sense of grim satisfaction, a feeling that a necessary, if unpleasant, deed has been done. Some openly laud the murderers as heroes, as saviors of Russia. Champagne is discreetly chilled. Some people in Petrograd were so happy. They probably wanted to declare a national "No More Rasputin Day," but had to settle for discreetly buying the conspirators a drink if they ever met them, or naming a particularly strong cocktail after them in whispered conversations. Among the common people, the reaction is more mixed, more complex. Some are horrified by the brutality. Others, who had come to see Rasputin as the source of all their woes, from wartime defeats to food shortages, rejoice openly. For many, it is simply another sign of the utter decay at the heart of the empire. Another chapter in a drama that seems to be spiraling out of control. Rasputin's body is eventually buried in a secret, hastily arranged funeral at Tsarskoye Selo, attended only by the imperial family and a few trusted retainers. Alexandra's grief is profound. She reportedly has a cross placed in his hands and an icon signed by herself, her children, and Anna Vyrubova. She sees him as a martyr, but the frozen reckoning is more than just the discovery of a body or the lenient punishment of aristocratic assassins. It's a reckoning for the monarchy itself, the murder intended by its perpetrators to save the dynasty by removing a corrupting influence, instead highlights its weakness, its isolation, and the deep fissures within the ruling class. It demonstrates that even members of the elite have lost faith in the Tsar's ability to govern and are willing to resort to violence to achieve their aims. The sacred aura of the autocracy is further tarnished. If grand dukes and princes can murder with near impunity, what does that say about the rule of law, about the Tsar's authority? The stunned silence of Petrograd is deceptive. Beneath the surface, the currents of revolution are running faster than ever. Rasputin's death does not bring the stability the conspirators hoped for. It does not restore trust in the Tsar or Tsarina. Instead, it removes a convenient scapegoat, forcing people to look more closely at the systemic failures of the regime itself. The dark stain of Rasputin's influence and the even darker stain of his murder seeps into the very foundations of Romanov rule, hastening its final, brutal end. The empire's trust, like Rasputin's body, lies cold and broken, beyond any hope of resurrection. The frozen corpse of Grigori Rasputin has been consigned to the earth in a secret grave, but his ghost, you find, lingers with a tenacious grip, particularly within the grief-stricken, isolated confines of the Alexander Palace. The frozen reckoning of his brutal murder does not, as the conspirators so desperately hoped, herald a new dawn of stability or a restoration of imperial prestige. Instead, it leaves behind a profound emptiness, an echoing void where trust once resided, and it seems only to accelerate the Romanov dynasty's slide into the abyss. The echoes you hear are those of Alexandra's continued lamentations for our friend, her unwavering belief in his martyrdom, while the emptiness is the chilling vacuum of authority surrounding a throne that is rapidly losing its legitimacy. You observe Tsarina Alexandra in the weeks following Rasputin's death. She is a figure of almost unbearable sorrow and unyielding bitterness. She pores over Rasputin's letters, clutches his icons, and reportedly even tries to communicate with his spirit through Anna Virubova, seeking his guidance from beyond the grave. This macabre devotion further isolates her from any remaining rational counsel, solidifying her image as a woman dangerously unmoored from reality. The nobles who killed Rasputin thought they were lancing a boil, but it turned out the entire patient was riddled with disease, and they just made it angrier and more aware of its symptoms, while simultaneously convincing the chief physician, Alexandra, that the only true medicine had been stolen. Outside the palace walls, the harsh winter of 1916-1917 grinds on. Petrograd is a city on edge. Food shortages are severe, the queues for bread growing longer and more restive in the biting cold. The war, that insatiable beast, continues to devour Russia's young men and its dwindling resources. Defeats at the front, coupled with the administrative chaos at home, a chaos Rasputin's meddling had so significantly exacerbated, fuel a deep, pervasive despair. With Rasputin gone, the public can no longer blame him for every ill. Their anger, their frustration, now focuses more directly on the government, on the Tsarina, and ultimately on the Tsar himself. The echoes of Rasputin's prophecies, particularly any dire warnings he might have given about the fate of the dynasty should harm befall him, now take on a more sinister resonance in the minds of those who believed in him, and perhaps even in the anxious thoughts of those who dismissed him. Had he foreseen this rapid unraveling? The storm breaks in late February 1917. Old style. It begins with strikes by factory workers in Petrograd, protesting the lack of bread. Women, weary of queuing for hours in the freezing cold only to find the bakeries empty, join the demonstrations. Their cries for bread soon mingle with shouts for "down with the autocracy" and "down with the war." The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, started to unravel like a badly knitted sweater caught on a very sharp nail of revolution. You witness the authorities' fumbling attempts to restore order. Police are sent in, then Cossacks, then regular army units. But the soldiers, many of them recent conscripts, peasants and workers in uniform, are themselves weary of the war, sympathetic to the plight of the demonstrators. Hesitation turns to fraternization, then to outright mutiny. Regiments begin to abandon their posts, some even joining the revolutionaries, their red flags a stark contrast to the white snow. News of the escalating chaos reaches Tsar Nicholas at military headquarters in Mogilev. Initially, he dismisses it as another bout of unrest, easily quelled. He orders the Petrograd garrison to fire on the crowds if necessary. But the messages from the capital grow increasingly dire. his government has lost control. His ministers are either in hiding or under arrest by self-proclaimed revolutionary committees. The Duma, which Nicholas had often tried to sideline, now steps into the power vacuum, attempting to form a provisional government and restore some semblance of order. Nicholas, finally grasping the severity of the situation, decides to return to Petrograd, hoping his presence will calm the storm. But it is too late. His train is diverted, blocked by revolutionary troops. He finds himself isolated, out of touch, his authority evaporating with each passing hour. Nicholas, trying to find a loyal general by the end, was probably like searching for a vegetarian wolf, theoretically possible, but not something you'd bet your crown on. His military commanders, the very men he had placed his trust in when he took command of the army, now advise him that the only way to save Russia, to continue the war effort, is for him to abdicate. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne on March 2, 1917 O.S. March 15th N.S., not in Petrograd, but at Pskov, aboard the Imperial train, after being pressured by generals and Duma representatives. You can almost feel the crushing weight of that moment. The Tsar, a man who believed himself divinely appointed, forced to sign away the heritage of his ancestors, the birthright of his son. He abdicates not only for himself, but also, initially, for Alexei, in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael. But Michael, wisely perhaps, refuses the poisoned chalice of the Russian crown unless it is offered by a constituent assembly. The Romanov dynasty effectively ceases to rule. The news of the abdication reaches Alexandra and her children at Tsarskoye Selo. They are now, in effect, prisoners. The once revered imperial family is subjected to the humiliation of house arrest, guarded by soldiers who wear red armbands. The echoes in the emptiness of the Alexander Palace are now the sounds of a dynasty's collapse, the hushed, fearful whispers of a family facing an unknown, terrifying future. The trust, so fatally undermined by years of misrule, by the corrosive influence of figures like Rasputin who preyed on their isolation and desperation, is now irrevocably broken. It's not just the trust of the people in their Tsar, but the Tsar's trust in his people, in his army, in his advisors. The entire edifice has crumbled. Whether the February Revolution was an inevitable consequence of Russia's deep-seated social, economic, and political problems, merely accelerated by the war and the Rasputin affair, or if the monarchy might have survived had different decisions been made in its final years, continues to be a central question in historical scholarship. Rasputin was undoubtedly a symptom, a grotesque manifestation of the sickness within the autocracy. His murder, far from curing the disease, merely highlighted its terminal stage. He was a convenient scapegoat, and his removal left the fundamental flaws of the system bare for all to see. The Romanovs' fate is sealed. From their gilded cage at Tsarskoye Selo, they will be moved further into the heart of Russia, deeper into captivity, their story spiraling towards its tragic conclusion in a Siberian cellar. The echoes of Rasputin's life, his influence, and his violent death reverberate through these final, desolate months, a grim reminder of how personal faith, when twisted by desperation and exploited by cunning, can contribute to the murder of an entire empire's trust, leaving only emptiness and the haunting shadows of what might have been. The echoes of the February Revolution and the Tsar's abdication now fade into a somber, uncertain silence, the kind that often follows a great and devastating storm. You find yourself standing, as it were, on the shores of a changed world, looking back at the tumultuous waters that have just swept away a 300-year-old dynasty. And in the heart of that maelstrom, the figure of Grigori Rasputin remains, a haunting Rorschach test onto which so many fears, beliefs, and accusations were projected. This is the empire's twilight, a time for reflecting on how one enigmatic peasant from Siberia came to mirror, and in many ways amplify, the tragic decay of the mighty Romanov dynasty. His story, as you've journeyed through it, from the snowbound villages of Siberia, through the hallowed halls of monasteries, into the glittering salons of Petrograd, and finally into the deeply private, almost hermetically sealed world of the imperial family, is a study in contrasts and contradictions. Was he a genuine holy man, a starets possessed of true spiritual insight and healing gifts? Or was he a supremely cunning manipulator, an opportunist who expertly exploited the vulnerabilities of a desperate Tsarina, and a beleaguered Tsar Rasputin managed to become a global celebrity posthumously, proving that a good, scandalous story has longer legs than most Siberian journeys, and certainly longer than his own ill-fated trip to the Moika Palace. After the Tsar's abdication, the provisional government placed the imperial family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. They were later moved to Tobolsk in Siberia, ironically, Rasputin's home region, and then to Ekaterinburg, where Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed in a cellar by Bolshevik revolutionaries in July 1918. This brutal end, foreseen by some in Rasputin's darker prophecies, cemented the fall of the Romanovs and plunged Russia into years of civil war and further upheaval. The echoes of Rasputin's influence, the accusations of his meddling, the scandal of his life and death, all became part of the narrative justifying this tragic end in the eyes of the revolutionaries. It's always easier, isn't it, to blame the weird mystic with the hypnotic eyes than to dissect decades of complex socio-economic policy failures. Serfdom's long shadow, industrial unrest, the Russo-Japanese War, and the inherent contradictions of a sprawling autocracy struggling to modernize. Rasputin was, if nothing else, a very convenient lightning rod for the accumulated discontent and anxieties of a society cracking under immense pressure. He became the face of the regime's corruption, its detachment, its seeming descent into irrationality. The stories of his debauchery, whether true, exaggerated, or fabricated, provided a lurid symbol of the moral decay at the top, while the tales of his influence over state appointments painted a picture of a government run by caprice rather than competence. The enduring popular fascination with Rasputin, often overshadowing more systemic analyses of the Russian Revolution, itself raises questions about how history is constructed and consumed, particularly when charismatic or controversial figures are involved. He's become a larger-than-life figure, a shorthand for decadence and doom, a villain in countless books and films. Yet, to reduce the fall of the Romanovs solely to his influence would be to ignore the vast, impersonal forces that were reshaping Russia and the world. He was not the disease itself, perhaps, but rather a particularly aggressive and visible symptom of a terminal illness within the body politic. His presence acted as an irritant, an accelerant, a catalyst that sped up the inevitable decay by shattering the last vestiges of public trust and making the monarchy appear both ridiculous and sinister. Historians and daydreamers alike still love to ponder, what if Rasputin had just stayed in Siberia and focused on, say, competitive potato carving, or perhaps perfecting his rustic dance moves for local festivals. The 20th century might have looked a little different in that particular corner of the world, or at least the Romanovs' final act might have played out with a different, perhaps less bizarrely memorable, supporting character. But he didn't. He was drawn to the center, and the center, in its weakness and desperation, drew him in. He filled a void that existed in the hearts of Alexandra and Nicholas, a void created by their isolation, their anxieties for their son, and their deep, if sometimes misguided, piety. He offered them certainty in a world of doubt, a sense of divine connection when they felt abandoned by earthly powers. The tragedy is that this very human need for comfort and assurance, when played out on the stage of absolute monarchy during a time of unprecedented crisis, had devastating public consequences. The trust that subjects place in their rulers is a fragile bond, built on perceptions of wisdom, justice, and competence. When that bond is repeatedly violated, when the rulers appear to be guided by forces seen as corrupt, irrational, or self-serving, it inevitably snaps. Rasputin, by becoming the symbol of everything that was wrong, helped to sever that bond with a brutal finality. He was the living embodiment of the murder of an empire's trust. And so, as the twilight deepens over the fallen empire, as the dust of revolution begins to settle, the figure of Rasputin remains, a complex and unsettling shadow. He is a reminder of how private belief can have public consequences, how desperation can lead to delusion, and how, sometimes, the fate of nations can be intertwined with the most unlikely and enigmatic of individuals. The lamplight that once illuminated his path from peasant hut to palace chamber has long been extinguished, but his story continues to flicker in the popular imagination. A dark, cautionary tale from a world that, in many ways, seems both incredibly distant and hauntingly familiar. The grand palaces stand silent now, their gilded halls empty of the laughter, the whispers, the desperate prayers you almost felt within their walls. The echoes of carriage wheels on cobblestones have long since faded into the murmur of a new and often harsher century. Let the image of those snow-swept Petrograd streets soften in your mind. The urgency of those clandestine meetings and whispered conspiracies now just a gentle, receding story. The chilling resolve of assassins, the profound grief of a Tsarina, the bewilderment of a falling Tsar, these too can now drift into the quiet realm of history, becoming less vivid, less immediate. As the narrative draws to its peaceful close, there are no more pronouncements to decipher, no more plots to uncover in the flickering lamplight. The immense weight of the empire, the crushing anxieties of wartime, the bitter taste of betrayal and broken trust, all these can gently dissolve, like snowflakes melting on a warm hand. The story has been told. The journey through that tumultuous past is complete, and all that remains is the soft, quiet invitation to rest. The characters, with their fierce passions and their tragic destinies, can now sleep within the pages of history, and you too can let the darkness be a comforting blanket, a gentle end to this long night's tale. All is quiet now. The whispers of the past have ebbed away, leaving only peace